The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast. Now, here's your host, Tony D'Angelo.
And a very good afternoon to all of you along all of the stations of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I am Tony D'Angelo. I am the host of Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast. This is the Afternoon Express Speaking of Everything edition. And today I'm going to be joined by a remarkable gentleman. His name, Arnie Wexler. I met him last year. He has spent his life dealing with helping people with the wreckage and the addictions of problem gambling. The great part about Arnie is he's one of the most wonderful people you're ever going to talk to. He's entirely down to earth. And if you know of anybody with any kind of an addiction, Arnie has some wonderful insights with respect to that. Arnie is the author of a book entitled All Bets Are Off, Losers, Liars, and Recovery from Gambling Addiction, which he wrote with his lovely wife Sheila and writer Steve Jacobson. You can find that on the Central Recovery Press bookshelf. And there's so many stories in there that really are just uplifting and cautioning and just wonderful information. I also want to get Arnie's take on what happened this week in the United States Supreme Court with the legalization of sports betting and what we can expect from that. I kind of get the sense it's not going to be very good. So, states have gotten involved and all of a sudden they're looking at the revenue and what type of an impact will this have societally? Well, I've got the best person in the world to talk to about that. So what I'd like for you to do is sit back, as Tom Snyder used to say, fire up a colorfina, have just your attentions tuned exactly to what's being said here today by Arnie. We got Chicago doing any way you want it. Well, on this station, you're only going to do it one way. That's going to be my way, and Arnie will be coming up really soon. Sit tight, folks. We'll have you back in a second. Ladies and gentlemen, on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, I am joined by this remarkable gentleman whom I came to know last year, Arnie Wexler. As we said in the beginning, Arnie is the author of a book entitled All Bets Are Off, Losers, Liars, and Recovery from Gambling Addiction, written with Arnie and his lovely wife Sheila Wexler with Steve Jacobson. You can find that on the shelves of the Central Recovery Press, and there is so much happening in the world of sports and gambling and states getting involved and just the issues upon people. And I'm honored and I'm pleased, and I'm so looking forward to this. And Arnie, good morning. How are you today, my friend?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
Oh, well, listen, the pleasure is more than so mine. We're before a different audience today, and what I'd like for them to know about you is, who is Arnie Wexler and what is his mission in life?
Well, I'm a recovering gambler. I placed my last bet on April 10th, 1968, and I've been trying to help gamblers in the last 50 years, and I've been in recovery for the last 50 years. I ran the Council on Compulsive Gambling for 8 years in New Jersey. And my wife ran a 100-bed drug, alcohol, and gambling treatment center for about 15 years in New Jersey. Now we run around the world talking and doing stuff on compulsive gambling issues.
It's a remarkable story. Now, in reading your book and in speaking to you previously, you were started gambling at almost an incredibly young age. Can you tell us about that?
Hello?
Yeah, Arnie? My question was, in reading your book and speaking to you previously, you had started gambling at a very young age. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I started gambling at 7 or 8 years old. I lived in Brooklyn as a kid and was flipping baseball cards, shooting marbles, pitching pennies, and playing pinball machines. At 17, I went to the racetrack for the first time. It was Memorial Day in 1951. And and I was making 50 cents an hour working in the garment center delivering packages. And I walked out of the racetrack that night with $54, and I thought, wow, I'm going to be a millionaire from gambling. Look how easy this is.
And this is something you had carried through your young adulthood, and something which actually, you describe in your book it's a fascination and it's an addiction, and how some people might have a glass of wine at dinner and other people get drunk. What particularly were you experiencing?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that last question.
Some people have a glass of wine at dinner and other people get drunk.
Right. Well, some people have the gene for compulsive gambling. And the sports betting thing is going to explode some of those people, because a lot of those people will never gamble illegally or do anything illegally. Now you're making it legal, and they feel comfortable, and they're going to try it. Some of those people that are going to try it are going to be addicted gamblers.
Now let's talk about that. This week, for perhaps the people who did not know, the United States Supreme Court came down with a ruling. I believe it was 6-3. I've been trying to get the count of it. That it's not possible to regulate gambling to any one thing, that any state could get involved in gambling or any kind of sports betting, if you will. And the fascinating thing for me has always been, this has always been illegal until governments have figured out a way to tax it. Now all of a sudden it's open season. I don't even know where to begin with this. I was talking with our friend Bob Lazzari earlier this morning, and I said, wasn't this what the Black Sox scandal was about? You had to separate sports and...
In 1991 or 2,
yeah.
Bill Bradley was a senator in New Jersey, and New Jersey wanted to put in sports betting. Only 3 states had some sort of form of sports betting. Las Vegas, I believe, Delaware had the right to do it, and I think Washington State or Oregon. So Bill Bradley put the bill in for 18 months, and it happened that the casinos were trying to put in all kinds of other stuff, so they waited for the last couple of weeks to push through sports betting. They thought it was a lock. So it turned out that it was stopped in committee, and it never got on the floor of the legislature. So sports betting was dead in New Jersey. And then what happened was another interesting thing happened. They put in the bill for internet gambling to be illegal. And then somebody put into that bill, and we still don't know who did it, an exclusion for fantasy sports. And that's why we have the fantasy sports going on today. But anyways, all of a sudden now they came back and they want to put gambling in sports betting legal. And that's how this whole thing started a couple of years ago.
And I'll tell you, as a sports fan, maybe not as a, whatever you want to call it, a fanatical sports fan. Sometimes I'm a casual sports fan. Other times I follow it. Certainly not as much as I did, in my younger years. What sort of a firewall is there for people actually participating, the players, the kids in the colleges? In your book, you mentioned the basketball scandals in the 1940s and the 1950s. You mentioned Boston College in 1996 and then 1979, which involved a kid from my hometown, Ernie Cobb, sort of parenthetically, and effectively ruined his chances of getting to the NBA. Are there any kinds of, firewalls? I noticed in the New York Times article, Tony Clark, the head of the Major League Baseball Players Association, of all people, was sort of talking about an integrity thing in professional sports and how will we protect integrity in baseball. If I'm understanding this, players here are really vulnerable to what may happen.
Well, pertaining to your question, I left out a little piece.
Sure.
In 1992, I sat at the Senate hearings in New Jersey, the committee hearings, and baseball was there, Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, hockey, they were all there and said, we don't want betting on our sports, we don't want gambling on our sports, and we think this bill should pass. Now they're all in the pocket of the sports betting people, because now they all want to get a piece of the action. And the proof of the pudding happened with New York. When they put in fantasy gambling, New York State Attorney General said, we don't want it in our state, and they blocked it. And then they made a deal with the fantasy sports people. They get 14.5%, and now it's legal in New York State. And that's what's going on here. The hypocrisy is a joke, because all the leagues now want the sports betting thing because they see it as a money fundraiser.
It's, you know, and I grew up as a kid in Stamford, Connecticut. I mean, one time I walked into a barber shop thinking I was doing something very grown up, and the barber cut my hair, and I told my father where I had been. And, you know, my father worked in a movie projection booth kind of above and to the right of the barber shop. And he pushed me against the wall and shook me, and he said, don't you dare go in there. They're gambling, and gambling is a bad thing. I mean, the whole thing of making gambling acceptable, where you are at on this thing as to, well, now it's legal, and now you can do it with a credit card. I mean, am I crazy here? There's no end in sight.
We're going to see such an explosion of gambling addicts in about 2 years, because that's how long it takes, that the Gamblers Anonymous rooms in America are going to be filled with people who aren't going to have room to sit in the rooms.
It's shocking to me. I mean, it's amazing. Let's talk.
It is amazing. If you look back at the last few years, they put in internet gambling, they put poker on TV and television, and every time they add these things, you see an influx of people. A couple of months ago, I got in contact with 4 young kids that called me for help. They were between 17 and 21, and they're gambling on the internet and the fantasy sports games. So it's becoming a circus here. There's a lot of young kids that are going to get addicted to this kind of gambling.
Well, and I, you know, I live in a small town in Connecticut. I come from a Connecticut city, but I live in a small town. And there's, you know, I live in a town literally with 3 traffic lights, which is, you know, not the way the most of the state is these days. And there's a little mart in the center of town where I go in, and it's like I try not to be a rude person, but when you have a chance to get first online, you do, because 3 or 4 people are just going to be playing every single lottery from here to the moon. And it's like, how difficult a stretch is that for a cash-starved state like mine to say, well, let's have the baseball odds today, you know, or let's do like the old bookies used to do, the parlays, if you can pick 4 games. I mean, this is all going to be legitimate. I can't get my head around it, Arnie. I just can't.
Well, Connecticut's an interesting state, because at one time they didn't want casinos in there, if you remember also.
Yes, I do.
They worked out a deal to get a piece of the action. It's okay to have casinos there. And, you know, that's what's going on all over the country today. You got states like New Jersey. Before casinos opened in 1977, you had 14 meetings of Gamblers Anonymous. 2 years later, you had 47 meetings. And the same thing happened in Iowa and Indiana, in Louisiana and Mississippi, and all these states that added gambling. They became an explosion of people looking for help.
It boggles at least my mind. Now, in your particular walk to recovery, 50 years ago you said that was enough. 50 years over this time, married to a lovely lady who stayed with you, worked with you, bless her heart, bless her soul. What particularly did you do? And the reason I ask this is I know of so many people who have differing addictions with things, or they have loved ones, and it's kind of like hope is often followed by challenge, followed by despair, followed by going back into the mess and coming out. What are some of the things that you can pass along to people that were of help to you that may help others? Because obviously the government here is going to make this kind of thing, if we want to talk about gambling, very, very easy to do.
Well, Tony, what I could really tell you is that in February 12th of 1968, I went for help for my gambling addiction. But the truth is I was lying. I didn't really go for help. I went there because somebody told me they straightened out money problems, and I thought that meant they were going to pay off my gambling debt. So I never went there with the intention to stop gambling. I went there with an intention to get a bailout. And I gambled 8 weeks after that for the last time, but it took me about 6 to 9 months to really believe that I was a compulsive gambler and I had to stop and I needed to stop. And I was 6 months clean, still dreaming and thinking about the big win that I could come up with. It takes a long time for a gambler to, even more than an alcoholic, see, this is a very hidden illness. You got people living in the house with a alcoholic or a drug addict. They see it, they smell it. With compulsive gambling, there's no track marks, there's no dilated pupils, there's nothing to see. The gambler doesn't fall down, there's no smell, so it's hidden and invisible. I remember getting a call from a lady, and this is pretty classical, you get this once in a while. She says, we're married 30 years. I never knew my husband gambled. He embezzled $600,000 from the insurance company he worked for, and he just was arrested by the FBI.
Yeah, it's and other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? It's man, oh man, oh man. One thing you mentioned in your book, and there's so many things in your book. Again, the book is All Bets Are Off: Losers, Liars, and Recovery from Gambling Addiction. Arnie and Sheila Wexler with Steve Jacobson. You mentioned driving by the racetrack and hearing on the radio that a horse had won a particular race, and you had to stop for a moment because you felt a chill. And I mean, and that's something I want to talk about. I guess someone who has an issue that recovers has always got to deal with the temptation.
Well, it's funny, even today, when they show the race on the TV, on the news, they'll show a feature race at the racetrack. I have to shut it off because I'm ready to say the outside horse, the inside horse, and I'm picking horses on TV, even at this point. So as soon as I see they're showing the race, I shut it off.
And I mean, I guess that is a valuable lesson as far as, quote unquote self-control. If we're speaking to loved ones here, if we're speaking to people who have someone in their family addicted to gambling or addicted, period, what are the kinds of things? Now, you mentioned this is sort of a silent killer, if you will. It doesn't really hit you until it does, like that poor wife. But are there some kind of telltale things here we can pay attention to as to where something may be going awry? And if that's the case, what can we do to try to get somebody back on the right track?
Well, the two things go on here. Most of the family members have no clue that the person is a compulsive gambler. It could be a spouse, it could be a wife, it could be a husband, could be family members. I get calls from teenage kids sometimes about my mother and father's gambling too much. So the bottom line is the family member needs to get help also. So the family member needs to go to an organization like Gam-Anon, which is for spouses and family members to learn how to help themselves because of the gambling addiction. But the worst thing that happens is family members don't understand what's going on, so they bail out the gambler, they pay off gambling debts, they help them get money, and it's just the bottom barrel. If you got a family member in your house that has a gambling addiction, my advice is sell everything you got and give it to them now. It's going to be less painful.
It's incredible. It's just... And now what we're doing is we're putting this on a perfectly legal plane and making this easier. And, it's, self-control is a great thing, but we don't seem to realize that there are folks that don't have self-control. In your book, you mentioned so many people who have been, shall we say, people of note in sports who have been, shall we say, with issues. And, a while back, we spoke about Pete Rose and the fact of, I think of him because as a kid playing ball and watching him, I thought, well, this is, God's definition of a baseball player. What actually went on with him? I mean, we see kind of a perception. We see him now. he'll put anything on a baseball for $250. He'll put he shot JFK, he sang with the Beatles, you name it, he'll do it. But was this something that actually reached back into his playing days, and baseball never dealt with it, or he never dealt with it?
If you got a situation like Pete Rose, once a week, I believe, he's in Las Vegas signing autographs, and he gets money constantly, and he's broke. I just saw an article a couple of weeks ago that his wife now is ready to pack him in because of the gambling stuff, and the first wife did it down the road. I never met Art. I met him one time in a restaurant, but Art Schlichter was the guy that I know best. He was a quarterback in the NFL.
He was great.
1980, I met him. I've been trying to help him for years. In 1996, I testified for him in Las Vegas in Judge Pro's court. And today he's sitting in jail again for embezzling a lot of money from people and swindling people. And Art has been out there almost 40 years, can't stop gambling. I've also dealt with NBA players and NFL players and some baseball players. So I've had my test with a few of these guys. And the worst part is they don't want to go for help because they don't want anybody to know. But here's a classic case what happened. I had a basketball player in my house, and I was trying to help him. He was a graduate from college. And I get a call one day, this is last summer, from an ex-NBA player. And we're having a conversation, and he's on the phone, and he's on the phone talking to me. And I got it on speaker, and this young man is listening to it. And I say to the guy, where did you do your gambling? He says, only Las Vegas. And the kid passes me a note. He says he used to gamble in Atlantic City because I used to gamble on the same table with him. So I asked him if he ever gambled in Atlantic City, and he says, oh, I forgot to tell you. And I counsel him now on the phone. He's an ex-NBA player.
And have you been to the leagues, the league offices, the league officials, and mentioned this, that you've got gambling players? Because in my poor little pea brain, which is of legendary proportions, I go back to watching, Newt Rockne All-American made in 1940 when Pat O'Brien, playing Newt Rockne, kicked the gambler out of the locker room and said there will be a separation. I can't do a great Pat O'Brien, but I have none of that kind here. You've already ruined horse racing, and just this thing of when college football was legitimized as an activity, that's a Chinese wall. We're not going into that. I mean. And, for obvious reasons, games could be fixed, players could be compromised. Have you been to leagues, and what kind of a response have you gotten?
Well, let me share a story with you. In 1999, Horace Palmer, who was the head of security for the NBA, called me up and said, would I fly to New York? And I went to the NBA office, and he sat with me for 4 hours. And he said, we'd like to hire you to speak to all the teams because we're worried about some of our players that might have a gambling problem. So I went there, and we spent the time, and he said, why don't you bring your wife in on Thursday? This was a Monday. He's bring your wife in on Thursday. So my wife flew up, and on Thursday we developed 20 questions that we were going to give the players. They approved it, and we were going to start talking to them in January, February, and March. And then I got a call in January that David Stern canceled it. He didn't want the media to find out, so they weren't going to do it. And some of that information is in my book. Even the questions are in the book.
Yeah, I see. And you also mentioned, which I think was, shall we say, some might call it anachronistic, but others like myself might call it good sense, that when you went to the racetrack years ago, there were not even telephones. It was just you placed your bet and that was that, and you were isolated to racing. Now it's, we walk around with these little things in our pockets where we could do just about anything.
Well, it's very interesting because I used to go to the racetrack. I never gambled in a casino, but I used to go to the racetrack almost every day or night, or both, sometimes both. And it was the most boring thing because every 20 minutes you had a bet. Now you get every 2 or 3 minutes you get bets from Africa and Europe and here and there and all over. So it's a constant play. It's almost like in the casino where you can play every minute.
And one of the things you do talk about in your book is how to tell if you or someone you love has a problem with gambling. And you talk about the fact of the gambler is always, if you go and you lose big, well, you know, you're Scarlett O'Hara, fiddle-dee-dee, tomorrow is a new day, and you're going to make it back. And that's part of this thing that just keeps grinding you farther and farther and farther into the mud. And it's amazing to me because obviously someone like you hit a wall and you said, well, there ain't no coming back from this other than getting back to the scrimmage line. And what was your moment personally where you said, okay, this I'm never going to make back what I lost, I'm going to go forward? What was your realization? Did it come at once or did it come over a period of time?
It took a long time in early recovery to get to that point, and it took years till the dream. I would wake up in the middle of the night and have a dream, even 5 and 10 years into recovery. I'd have a dream that I gambled, and it felt so real, and I'd wake up and my head was full of sweat. And, you know, this is not a thing that just goes away by itself, and it doesn't go away in a minute. It takes a long time to get recovery really working in the brain of a gambler because we are that sick. There's some deficiency in the brain of a compulsive gambler that other people don't have. You know, let me share another story.
Please do.
Very interesting. I worked for a company where there were 400 people working, and I was the plant manager. So if you came in and sold me, it was a big dress company. If you came in and sold me boxes, I had to get a percentage back in my pocket. If I had air freight business going on, I got a kickback. If I sold hangers or cleaning service, anything that went on in that factory, I had to get a kickback or you couldn't get the job. So one day a guy comes in and he says to me, I want to sell your boxes. And he says, and I ask him for a little kickback, and he says, no, I don't do that. He said, but I have great information at the racetrack. Well, to me, my eyes lit up, and I said, wow, that's even better than any money I can get. So I go with the guy to Roosevelt Raceway, and a guy comes and sits. I sit next to the guy, and another guy comes and sits there before the races, and he gives him an envelope of money, and he tells him what races to bet on. And I'm a 2-win, 2-place bettor at the time. I must have been maybe 18 years old or so, maybe 19. And in a month, I got $4,000 in the bank. And I still don't know who these people are. I don't know who the guy that brought me there, and I don't know who's giving him the information. And one day I'm running to the window to make a bet, and the guy says to me, hey, why don't you give me the information that, and he names a top jockey in the Trotters, a driver at the Trotters, a real top driver. And he says, I'll give you $50. So I gave him the information, and $50, I was making, I think, like $2 an hour maybe at that time, maybe even less. So it was great information. And the guy that was getting the horse races information from this trotting driver was an ex-Major League Baseball player, a good one. So that's what went on for a few months, maybe 6 months, until the driver got kicked out of Roosevelt Raceway because they didn't like some of the stuff that was going on.
It's absolutely amazing. It's and I mean, it just about calls any activity we may watch today to question. And of course, it's sort of ironic that we're actually speaking here on the day of the Preakness Stakes, which I'm sure is like a New Year's Eve, quote unquote, and quotation marks, to so many, and many will be in trouble because of it.
You know, it's interesting. I didn't even know today was Preakness Day, and I didn't know a couple of weeks ago was Kentucky Derby Day until after the fact. But let me share a story with you about that.
Certainly.
I got married in 1963, I believe it was, and I had bet a horse called Sherlock. My wife's name was Sheila, and I looked at the horses that were in the Kentucky Derby, and I saw Sherl luck, and I thought that was a signal to me to make a bet. I bet $200 on Sherlock at the Kentucky Derby, and it lost. And then I bet $200 on it in the Preakness, and it lost. And then we got married May 27th. And then I think that weekend was the Belmont Stakes. Maybe it was the next weekend, but it was as we got married, we went to Bermuda on our honeymoon. And I didn't make a bet because I decided I was never going to gamble again, which I didn't know that was possible. And I thought that I could not gamble again because we're getting married and I wasn't going to gamble. So we're in Bermuda, and I pick up a paper, and Sherlock wins and pays $132, and that was a disaster in my head. You know, right away I thought, why did I marry her and not be at the Belmont Stakes that day? And then the other thing happened in Bermuda. We got down there, and there was a jar of jelly beans in the lobby, and it said, you could win a free trip to New York if you get how many jelly beans in the jar. And I had a ticket back to New York. So I spent the first 3 days, maybe the first 4 days, more time with the jelly bean jar than with my wife.
Oh dear. It's no one can describe the grips of this better than you can, my friend. You know, you've dealt with, you go through your book, you talk about Tim Donaghy, you talk about Michael Jordan, you talk about Schleister and Rose, and Chet Forty, who really, a large part of my life was watching The Wide World of Sports, who really couldn't have been done without Chet Forty. And most recently...
That one with you. I get a call from a lawyer, and he tells me that he needs to talk to me, and I would come to his office. No, he says, I'm going to send a guy to come to meet you. So... I'm speaking in a treatment center in Hoboken, New Jersey, and the guy comes to meet me in the treatment center, sits in the back while I'm doing an hour lecture. And about 45 minutes through the lecture, and I still don't know who this guy is at the time, and he raises his hand and he says, wow, I've been gambling for a lot of years, and I never understood it until I just heard what you were just talking about. And one of the clients there turns around and said, that's Chet Forte. And that's how I found out who he was. And I testified to him in his court case, and he got probation, and I had him live with me for about a week, and I got him on Mike Francesca and Mad Dog at that time, the show in New York. So I get him on the show, and he does the whole interview. And they stopped the commercials, would you believe, and they had him on for 45 minutes. So next day, he gets a call from some guy that owned Mighty 1060, a San Diego radio station, and they hire him. And I've been in contact with them during that whole period of time. And then I get a call from some people in California that are in recovery. They said, you know, this guy is full of baloney. He's on the air picking games. So I call him on the phone. I said, Chet, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. If you're a recovering gambler, you don't need to get involved with that. And he stopped picking games after that. And then a year later, he had a heart attack and died.
And you stop and think about what that man did for just the technocracy of sports broadcasting, and he's just a brilliant guy.
Something else hit me. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, it's all right.
This is what happened. I'm sitting with Chet, and he tells me he's directing Monday Night Football. And he says he has a television, and he's watching games that he's bet on. And all of a sudden, he's watching the game, and he misses plays, and they're not putting on the camera shots that should be put on because he's watching his game. And that's what goes home with compulsive gambling. He also took a mortgage on his house that was way over the top, and he couldn't pay it, and he was in trouble with that. And that's what really got him in trouble, because he did some illegal things to get a mortgage in his house.
And just the brilliant resume and skill that man had. You know, and this is something, and you know, in your counseling.
You know what? I want to throw something else up there.
Sure.
Chet told me that when he was working for ABC, Rune Arledge would see the bookmakers come in and talk to Chet and get money and payoffs and all kinds of stuff. And this was Chet's words to me, that Rune Arledge told him, it's okay, but don't bet more than $50 a game. So people really don't understand this addiction. If you don't have this addiction, or you don't have a family member that is involved with compulsive gambling, you really don't get it.
You know, and this is something I think which is little discussed. It's like if you know, you're familiar with Connecticut. I spend you know, a fair amount of time during the week in New Haven, which is like South Central. It's the dead center part of the state, you know, right on the coastline. And occasionally, instead of going back home the way I usually go, I'll take the 95 out to the casinos, which probably has to be about the worst, most idiotically designed configuration ever on the planet, even for the Connecticut DOT, because it's all left exits. But what will happen is many times you'll see two white-haired people driving in the left lane with a New York or New Jersey plate, going about 45 and 50 miles an hour, don't want to miss the turn. You know, they're going to the casino. And I have read cases where, you know, if we're going to call them grandma and grandpa, you know, grandpa's worked in the, you know, the aircraft factory for 40-something years. He has a decent pension and saved a little bit of stock, and he's put his kids through school, and now he's sitting around with nothing to do, and he becomes this fanatical gambler, like the nicest guy in the block. Have you counseled people like that who just never gambled, but then they retire and then they become, you know, problem gamblers?
Yeah, and that does happen. People that mostly it's happening with a lot of female gamblers that never gambled in their life, and all of a sudden the casinos come to town, they become slot players. I'm saying that 90% of the female gamblers are slot players, and they're coming in for help like crazy. And yeah, some of them never gambled before 60, 70, 80 years old. It's absolutely crazy. And I guess they had the gene all along, but they never got involved with it. And once they get involved with it, they get hooked. You know, you talk about Connecticut and the Jersey drivers. You know, some people are trying to control their gambling. So they live in New Jersey and they go on the exclusion. This is a classic case of a woman. She goes on the exclusion list in New Jersey. Then she's gambling in Pennsylvania. Then she goes on the exclusion list in Delaware. Then she goes on the exclusion list someplace else. And it keeps going on and on. And then I get a call from her about 2 years ago, and she says, I'm in trouble. I said, what happened? She said, I was gambling in Pennsylvania on the exclusion list, and she wins a jackpot. And she pulls her boyfriend over to the machine, and then they come down to pay, and they saw on the screen that she hit the jackpot, not the boyfriend. So they start talking to her. She runs in the bathroom, takes her wig off, and runs to her car, and she gets arrested for gambling in Pennsylvania on the exclusion list. But these people that you see in Connecticut, some of them are hiding from that nobody should catch them. They don't want to be seen maybe in Atlantic City or in Philadelphia, so they go to Connecticut. But you also have people that are on the exclusion list that maybe in New York and maybe in Pennsylvania, so now they're trying to gamble in Connecticut.
It's listen. This is why we have you to discuss this. One thing I wanted to mention to you is I have friends in the securities industry or associates in the securities industry. Some are, you know, I mean, basically they're, you know, shall we say, professional advisors in finance. Some of the others doing things, you know, maybe a little bit rich for my blood, like Bitcoin or something like that. And I, you know, I'm still trying to get my arms around that. You know, how you can attribute value to something where there really doesn't seem to be any. But I would imagine this whole thing of gambling, I mean, and this is really my fundamental question, Arnie, what separates an investor from a gambler, and what separates risk? You know, because I'm in business, I take risks every day. People take risks. You take a risk when you go on the highway. What separates risk from recklessness?
I was in the stock market when I was 17 years old, maybe even younger. I had a boss that told me he was in the stock market. He said, why don't you go into the stock market? So he bought me 5 shares of General Motors, and every week he would take some money out of my pay, so I owned the stock. And I was involved in shenanigans in the stock market when I was probably a teenager or maybe a little older than that. There used to be pink sheets, and I go into the brokerage firm, and I find pink sheets in the garbage pail, and I figure out how they work. So now I buy stock in the morning, because in those days there were no computers. Today I'd be put in jail for what I did. So I call the broker, and I say, I'm another brokerage firm like Merrill Lynch. I want to buy 5,000 shares of this particular stock. And I bought $200 worth of it in the morning, and the stock is $1. And by the end of the day, I'm calling 14 different brokers. I'm calling few people that are on the pink sheet that make the trades. And I'm pumping up the stock, and it's $6 or $7, and I sell it. And the next day, of course, it's back to $1 or 2 days later. And I did that for a long time to supplement my gambling addiction. And I was in the stock market pretty interesting for a long time.
So it's the attitude. That's the
biggest roulette wheel in America today.
Yeah. And it's certainly played that way. I mean, you go to the you turn on the cable news networks, and there's very attractive and intelligent men and women telling you what to do and telling you what's happening, and it's you raise an interesting point. In our closing moments together, Arnie, with this Supreme Court ruling, with the fact that this is going to start exploding everywhere, what are some things you're going to be involving your people that you're counseling not to do and to stay away from?
Well, you got to stay away from places where it's gambling, but it's almost impossible today because if you go into a grocery store, when I stopped gambling, there were no lotteries.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that's pretty interesting too. When the lotteries came into existence, I was spending $200, $300, $400 a week on lottery tickets. Even though I was making $60 a week, I was stealing enough to support my lottery tickets. And if I go to the racetrack and I won, Monticello Racetrack used to sell lottery tickets in '68, maybe '67, earlier than that. So the first year that I had lottery in New York, they were selling it in Monticello, and I was still buying tickets. If I won, I bought extra tickets. So I was addicted to lottery pretty heavy also. And what you need to do is stay away from anything that has to do with gambling, but it's very difficult today. You listen to the news, and they're telling you the team is 3 points favorite or 8 points favorite or 3 points under. You never heard that in the 60s, but today it's all wide open.
Now, as a matter of fact, they threw Al Regatas off of his color commentary job for doing just that. Yeah.
We're also not allowed to advertise casinos or any gambling on the TV and the radio, and somebody changed that bill too, somewhere maybe in the 70s or 80s. So gambling's in your face all the time. You say today's the Preakness. I didn't know it. I guarantee you, everybody in America, not everybody, but a lot of people know that today's the Preakness, and it's going to be all over the news, and it was all over the last couple of days, and you know, it's permeated the whole country. Gambling is like getting a hamburger today.
Yeah, and forewarned is forearmed. The book, All Bets Are Off, must reading. Losers, Liars, and Recovery from Gambling Addiction. I'm speaking with one of the authors, Arnie Wexler. Arnie, there's so many people that are going to be listening to this, and they're going to want to get in touch with you and receive your excellent counsel and guidance and the care and love that you've done for, you know, so many years to make these situations right. Where can they reach you?
I have a national number called 888-LAST-BET. That's 888-LAST-BET. They can also look on YouTube or Google and put in Arnie Wexler. You see a lot of stuff, and you'll be able to contact me on the internet.
And, you know, to your, beyond anyone's credit, you've never run from a situation, and you've always held yourself out to help so many, and I know I am grateful, and I know others are too. Listen, my friend, thanks so much. Best to Sheila. You go out today and have a wonderful time, and we will be talking soon, I am sure.
Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day also. You're terrific, and your questions were wonderful.
Well, listen, it's only because of my guests, Arnie. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Special thanks to our good friend Arnie Wexler, talking about all things gambling and the issues it'll cause. Be sure to be with us next week. We're working on a couple of interesting guests, and we'll be taken out by Chicago any way you want it. Again, well, it's only going to be the way it is here with me doing this, and I'm so grateful you listened today. This is Tony D'Angelo here saying to all the stations on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, go out and make it a great day today, as David Hartman would say. Take care. God bless. Bye now.